For 6 years, everyone believed I was the reason my marriage never produced children. By the time my marriage ended, people weren't even trying to hide what they thought anymore. They lowered their voices when I walked into a room, exchanged sympathetic looks, and offered the kind of pity that feels more insulting than cruelty. The strange thing was that nobody had ever asked me directly. Nobody knew the facts. Nobody had seen medical records. Nobody had spoken to a specialist. They simply accepted a story because they had heard it enough times to assume it was true. According to that story, I was the woman who couldn't give her husband a family. The woman whose marriage slowly fell apart because she couldn't give Ryan the one thing he wanted most. The woman who ended up alone while her ex-husband moved on and found happiness with someone else. It was a simple story, easy to understand, and unfortunately for me, it was completely false. If you enjoy stories about family betrayal, hidden secrets, and people who eventually face the consequences of their own actions, subscribe to Unspoken Truth, because we share stories like this every day. My name is Claire Bennett, and for most of my adult life I worked as an emergency room physician. It was an exhausting, chaotic, and emotionally demanding job, but I loved it. There were days when I left the hospital completely drained, yet still satisfied because I knew I had helped someone through one of the worst moments of their life. Ryan used to say that my dedication was one of the things he admired most about me. When we first met, he seemed proud of my accomplishments and often told people he loved being married to a woman who was intelligent and ambitious. Over the years I have found myself wondering whether that version of Ryan ever truly existed, or whether it was simply the version he wanted me to see while everything was going well. When we got married, our future seemed very clear. We wanted a family. During the first few years we talked constantly about having children. We imagined what they would look like, discussed possible names, talked about schools, vacations, and all the ordinary conversations couples have when they are building a life together. At first there was no pressure. We assumed it would happen when the time was right. Then months passed and nothing changed. Then years passed. Slowly those conversations stopped feeling exciting and started becoming uncomfortable questions. We were no longer talking about when we would have children. We were beginning to ask why it wasn't happening. The first person who made me feel like it was somehow my fault was Linda, Ryan's mother. At first her comments were subtle enough to ignore. She would casually mention how quickly some women became pregnant. She would talk about friends whose children had already started large families. She made seemingly innocent observations about biological clocks and the importance of not waiting too long. Each comment by itself sounded harmless. The problem was that they never came alone. They appeared again and again at family gatherings, holiday dinners, and celebrations. Over time those remarks stopped feeling casual and started feeling directed specifically at me. I remember one family dinner in particular because it was the first time I felt genuinely uncomfortable. Someone asked whether Ryan and I planned to have children soon. Before I could answer, Linda laughed softly and said that some things simply weren't within a person's control. Several people smiled awkwardly. Nobody said anything. Ryan didn't either. That was the first time I expected him to defend me and the first time he chose to remain silent. Later that evening, when we got home, I tried talking to him about what had happened. He told me I was probably overreacting, that his mother meant no harm, and that it wasn't worth turning isolated comments into family conflicts. At the time I decided to let it go. I had no idea it would become the beginning of something much larger. As the years passed, the rumors started spreading in ways I never fully understood. Some people began asking strange questions. Others simply assumed I was dealing with fertility problems. The most frustrating part was that nobody seemed willing to consider any other possibility. In everyone's mind, the problem was me, always me. Meanwhile, Ryan remained silent. He never confirmed the rumors, but he never corrected them either. He allowed people to draw their own conclusions and continued living his life. I tried to ignore it because I still believed it was temporary, an uncomfortable phase that would eventually pass. Eventually I started suggesting something that seemed completely reasonable to me. I asked Ryan if we could both undergo medical testing, not because I was looking for someone to blame, but because I wanted answers. I was a physician. I understood perfectly well that fertility issues could have many causes and were not automatically connected to the woman. However, every time I brought up the subject, Ryan found a way to avoid it. He said we were still young. He said stress was probably a factor. He said things would happen when they were meant to happen. There was always a reason to postpone the conversation, and for years I accepted those answers because I trusted him. What I didn't know was that while I was still trying to save our marriage, Ryan was already destroying it from another direction. I began noticing small changes: more time away from home, more work meetings, more phone calls that mysteriously ended whenever I entered the room. I tried convincing myself I was imagining things because the alternative was too painful to consider. Then one afternoon I received a phone call that changed everything. It didn't come from a private investigator or an anonymous source. It came from someone who knew me, someone who had seen something they couldn't ignore. That was how I discovered Ryan was involved with another woman. The worst part wasn't discovering the affair. The worst part was discovering who that woman was. It was Megan, my best friend. The same person who had spent years sitting beside me while I talked about my marriage. The same person who knew every fear, every insecurity, and every struggle I was dealing with. For weeks I tried convincing myself there had to be another explanation. I wanted to believe it was some kind of misunderstanding, but the evidence was impossible to deny. And when I finally confronted Ryan, he didn't even try to hide it. Our divorce followed soon after, and when it was over, the story that spread throughout the entire town was exactly the one Linder had been building for years. Ryan had left a wife who couldn't give him children, and now he had found a new chance to build the family he had always wanted. What I didn't know at the time was that their lie was about to become the biggest mistake of their lives, because barely a year after the divorce, I heard news about Ryan and Megan that caused a very simple question to form in my mind, and that question would eventually destroy everything they believed they had built. A year after the divorce, my life looked very different from the one I had imagined when I signed those papers. The first few months had been difficult, not only because I had lost a 6-year marriage, but because I had also lost 2 of the people I trusted most. There were days when the betrayal hurt more than the divorce itself, because part of me could understand how a marriage could fail. What I could never fully understand was how someone could look you in the eye for years, listen to your fears, share your confidence, and at the same time quietly help destroy your life. However, as painful as it was, time eventually started doing its job. I focused on my work at the hospital, accepted additional responsibilities, became involved in several important projects, and slowly built a routine where Ryan and Megan no longer occupied every thought in my mind. I wasn't completely happy yet, but I was in a much better place than I had been during the final years of my marriage. The strange thing was that while my life was beginning to stabilize, the narrative Linder had created continued to grow. Every time I ran into someone from town, I heard slightly different versions of the same story. Some people were convinced Ryan had spent years suffering in a hopeless marriage. Others spoke about him as though he were a man who had finally been given a second chance to build the family he always deserved. Some even admired Megan for supposedly bringing happiness back into his life. At first those conversations bothered me deeply, but eventually I learned to ignore them. Arguing with rumors is like trying to stop a storm by shouting at the wind. Besides, I knew things they didn't know. I knew there were details hidden beneath the surface that would completely change how people viewed the situation. What I didn't realize was that I would soon come face to face with the very woman who had spent years spreading those rumors. It happened during a particularly busy morning at the hospital. I had already spent several hours treating patients and barely had time to grab a cup of coffee when a nurse informed me that I was needed for an additional consultation. There was nothing unusual about that. I walked through the hallways reviewing information on my tablet while heading toward the appropriate department, but as I turned a corner, I immediately recognized 2 faces I never expected to see there. Ryan and Megan were sitting together in the waiting area. For a moment I considered simply walking past them and pretending I hadn't noticed them. After all, they were no longer part of my life. But before I could continue, Megan looked up and our eyes met. The first thing I noticed was that she was pregnant. I didn't need medical charts or explanations to understand what I was seeing. It was obvious. For a brief moment I felt a strange mixture of emotions that I still struggle to describe today. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't jealousy. If anything, it was disbelief. Because that image represented the exact story the town had been telling for the past year. Ryan had left the woman who couldn't give him children, and now he was building the family he had always wanted with someone else. It was the perfect ending to the version of events Linda had spent years promoting. I tried to continue walking without interacting with them, but I wasn't that lucky. I had barely made it a few steps before I heard a familiar voice calling my name. It wasn't Ryan. It wasn't Megan. It was Linda. When I turned around, I immediately recognized that expression of satisfaction I had seen countless times throughout my marriage. She approached me with a smile that looked carefully rehearsed and spent the first few moments making polite conversation about work and the hospital. But I knew Linda far too well to believe she had come over just to be friendly. She never started conversations without a purpose. After a few minutes, she glanced toward Megan and then looked back at me, and that was when she said exactly what I had expected her to say. With a smile full of false sympathy, she commented that life had a funny way of revealing the truth. She said some people were simply meant to have families while others weren't. Then she added that she hoped time had helped me accept that certain things could never be changed. Her tone sounded kind on the surface, but every word was carefully designed to remind me of the role she had assigned me years ago. According to Linda, I was the woman who had failed, the woman who couldn't give her husband children, the woman who had been replaced by someone who could. Years earlier, a conversation like that probably would have devastated me. I would have defended myself, argued, and felt an overwhelming need to prove her wrong. But something had changed after the divorce. Maybe it was experience, maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe I simply no longer needed approval from people who had already chosen to believe a lie. So I stood there quietly while she finished her little speech, and when she finally stopped talking, I smiled calmly and asked her a very simple question. I asked whether Ryan had ever shown them the test results. The smile disappeared from her face almost immediately. For several seconds she looked genuinely confused, as though she wasn't even sure what I was talking about. She asked what results, and I calmly explained that I meant the medical tests. The tests Ryan had finally agreed to take years earlier, the same tests that explained far more than she realized. For the first time since I had known her, I saw real uncertainty in Linda's eyes. She opened her mouth as though she wanted to respond, but no words came out. She glanced toward Ryan and Megan, then back at me. It was obvious she didn't understand what was happening. What she still didn't know was that she had spent years building an entire story using incomplete information. She had blamed the wrong person, defended the wrong person, and repeated a lie so many times that she eventually convinced herself it was the truth. As I watched her expression change, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time: relief. For years I had been the only person forced to carry the weight of those rumors. Now, for the first time, someone else was beginning to question the version of events they had accepted without hesitation. And the best part was that Linda still didn't know the most important piece of the story. Because the truth didn't just have the power to destroy the lie she had spent years spreading, it also had the power to destroy Ryan and Megan's engagement. And very soon everyone would understand exactly why. The rest of that day passed like any other shift at the hospital. I treated patients, reviewed charts, attended consultations, and carried on with my responsibilities. But I would be lying if I said my mind wasn't returning again and again to the look on Linda's face when I mentioned the medical tests. Because for years she had spoken with complete certainty, she had never questioned her version of events, never considered the possibility that she was wrong. And yet a single question had been enough to shake her confidence. The truth was that I had never wanted to humiliate her. In fact, for much of my marriage I had protected Ryan far more than he deserved. When we finally received the results of those tests years earlier, I could have shown them to family members, friends, and anyone else spreading rumors. I could have ended the speculation immediately, but I chose not to, because I believed some things should remain private. Even when our marriage was struggling, even when I was tired of being blamed, I still believed my husband's medical information was not something to be used as a weapon. The reality was much simpler than everyone imagined. After years of trying unsuccessfully to have children, I insisted that both of us undergo comprehensive testing. I completed every examination my doctors recommended, and my results came back exactly as expected. There was no significant medical issue preventing pregnancy. The specialists suggested Ryan undergo additional testing as well. And after months of avoiding the subject, he finally agreed. When those results arrived, I still remember. A silence that filled the room, because even I was surprised by what they revealed. Ryan's fertility levels were extraordinarily low, so low that the specialists explained natural conception would be extremely unlikely. They didn't say it was absolutely impossible, but they made it clear the chances were minimal enough that alternative options would likely be necessary if we wanted children. The news devastated Ryan. For weeks he barely spoke about it. He avoided conversations about the results and seemed unable to fully accept what the doctors had told him. And that was exactly why I protected him. I never shared those results with anyone, not even my own parents. When Linda made comments about my supposed infertility, I remained silent. When relatives made uncomfortable assumptions, I remained silent. When friends quietly blamed me for our situation, I remained silent, because I genuinely believed Ryan would eventually find the courage to correct the story. I thought that sooner or later he would tell the truth or at least ask people to stop blaming me. But that moment never came. Instead, he allowed the rumors to grow until they became accepted as fact by almost everyone around us. A few days after the encounter at the hospital, strange things started happening. Apparently Linda had confronted Ryan about our conversation, and his reaction immediately raised more questions than answers. According to a mutual acquaintance, they argued for hours that evening, because for the first time Linda wanted to know why she had never seen the test results I mentioned so confidently, why Ryan had kept them hidden for years, and why he suddenly became so defensive whenever the subject came up. At first he tried to dismiss the entire conversation, but the more questions she asked, the more nervous he became, until eventually he admitted something he had spent years refusing to acknowledge publicly. What happened next was almost inevitable. Once Linda learned the truth about Ryan's medical results, she started questioning everything else she had accepted without evidence, especially one detail she could no longer ignore. Because if Ryan's fertility issues were as serious as I had implied, then there was a very uncomfortable question hanging over Megan's pregnancy. For an entire year everyone had treated that pregnancy as proof that I had been the problem all along, but suddenly their situation looked very different. People started asking questions they had never considered before, questions nobody wanted to say out loud at first, but questions that refused to disappear. The tension exploded over the following weeks. Family members whispered behind closed doors, friends exchanged theories, and rumors spread faster than anyone could control them. Ryan desperately tried to contain the situation, insisting that doctors could be wrong, claiming unlikely pregnancies happened all the time, and arguing there was no reason for anyone to doubt him. But every explanation seemed to create even more suspicion, especially because he still refused to show anyone the full medical reports or explain why he had hidden them for so many years. The harder he fought to protect the story, the weaker that story became. Eventually the pressure became impossible to manage. Arguments between Ryan and Megan became more frequent, tensions inside their relationship intensified, and what began as a simple question slowly transformed into a crisis neither of them could control, until finally the truth emerged, and it was far worse than anyone expected. Because Megan eventually admitted she had been involved with another man during the same period she had been with Ryan, a confession that instantly shattered everything they had built on the ruins of my marriage. When the truth became public, the reaction was exactly what you would expect. Ryan went from being the man everyone pitied to the man who had spent years allowing a lie to destroy his marriage. Linda went from confidently blaming me for everything to realizing she had spent years defending a false narrative. And Megan lost what little credibility she still had, because the story they had worked so hard to sell completely collapsed, revealing a reality far more embarrassing and painful than their one they had tried to hide. The strangest part of all was that I never had to seek revenge. I never published Ryan's medical records, never launched a campaign to clear my name, and never tried to convince anyone that I was right. I simply answered a question when the right moment arrived, and sometimes that is enough, because lies can survive for years when nobody challenges them. But once the truth appears, even quietly, those lies often collapse under their own weight. Today, when I look back on everything that happened, I no longer feel anger. For a long time I thought losing my marriage had been the most painful part of the story. Then I believed the betrayal by my best friend had hurt even more. But eventually I realized both experiences simply forced me to walk away from people who were never truly on my side. While they spent years trying to protect a lie, I continued building my career, helping my patients, and creating a life I could be proud of. In the end, the woman everyone called broken turned out to be the only person who never needed to lie about who she was, and the truth they worked so hard to bury eventually found its way to the surface all on its own.